Good day, everyone. Welcome. And I know some folks are still logging on, but in the interest of time and to respect your time, we want to get going on this. And so, just a word of welcome. I'm Hiroshi Motomura. I'm professor at the UCLA School of Law. I'm also faculty co-director of the UCLA School of Law's Center for Immigration Law and Policy, and I'll be moderating the discussion. Before we go any further, I want to say a couple things. Importantly, to acknowledge that the Center for Immigration Law and Policy UCLA acknowledges its presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. Uh, as a center devoted to the study of migration, we feel a special connection with questions of land and migration and settlement. So it's very important to us. I also want to mention a housekeeping thing, which is that we'll plan to go till around 1:45 or so at Pacific time, so for about 45 minutes. And then we want to have your questions, and so we will take questions as they arise, which you're welcome to put in the Q&A function here, and we'll go till up to 2:15 Pacific, 5:15 Eastern, or wherever you may be. So please put your questions in the Zoom webinar function. Also, we're recording this, and we'll post the video to CILP's YouTube channel. Okay, so let me first take a moment and introduce our speakers today, our panelists. These are the principals who have put this project together, but I'd like you to, as I introduce you, please turn on your cameras. First is our Professor Ahilan Arulananthan. He's a professor from practice and with me a faculty co-director of the Center for Immigration Policy, otherwise known as CILP at UCLA School of Law. I'd also like to introduce Professor Kelly Lytle Hernandez. Kelly's the Thomas E. Lifka Endowed Chair of History at UCLA. She's also the founding director and principal advisor for Million Dollar Hoods, an organization that maps the fiscal and human costs of mass incarceration. And our third panelist is Mariah So, who's the GIS, Graphic Information Systems Specialist for Million Dollar Hoods, and the creator of many of the presentations and modes of presentation that you'll find at the Mapping Deportations website. So welcome, and we're really eager to hear what you have to say about this very important project, a long time in the making, and well worth the wait. Before I turn it over to some questions that I'd like to pose to introduce us to what this website is about and the rationale of the project, its purposes, I just want to acknowledge our project partners. We have several that the Center for Immigration Law and Policy, CILP at UCLA School of Law, Million Dollar Hoods, which I just explained as an organization to map the fiscal and human costs of mass incarceration. We also want to acknowledge the National Immigration Project, which is a membership organization that's been playing an essential role in coordinating support and community with regard to immigrants' rights and broader justice questions, including impacts of the criminal legal system. And we also want to acknowledge the generous support of Unbound Philanthropy, which is a funder, a foundation that has been taken very seriously the need to foster forward-looking and innovative work like mapping deportations. So before I keep saying I'm going to turn it over to the panel, but I keep having more to say. Let me just before asking the first question, because we have a couple of rounds of questions here, and we'll use these questions to kind of communicate what this is all about. But we're here to learn about a new website. It's mappingdeportations.com. It features the first ever map of deportation from the United States since 1895. And it sets that map in a historical context. And that's the context that unmasks the deep history of racism in the US immigration system. And this is just as an opening comment, I think it's very important to talk about race and immigration control. which is what deportation is. It's part of immigration control because the two dimensions here that I think are worth naming, even though they are very much front and center. Uh, and one is race as a through line in U.S. immigration and citizenship law. There have been explicit racial and restrictions in citizenship and immigration access since the founding of the country. But there's a modern myth that race is somehow less foundational than it was in the past, and that's not true. They're just taken different forms, and I think that mapping deportations is very much about that project and uncovering what the through line is. And the other aspect of this dimension is that immigration control isn't just a matter of who you let in. There's a lot of talk about admissions, whether it's family or temporary work, whatever it may be. But just as important is immigration control as a matter of who, not just who you let in, but whom you force to leave. Um, some of it's based on the categories that can be deported. Sometimes, at least as much on who you enforce law against which communities, what the selective aspects of enforcement look like, what due process is required, and what is not acknowledged. And so those dimensions are really brought together in this project. And so, I'm not, but on the project, I'm not the expert. The experts are our panelists today. And I'm really looking forward to what they have to say. So here's the first round of questions, and I'll start with you, Kelly. Could you just tell us what the origin story is for this website?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thank you, Hiroshi. I always learn so much from you. So the origin story of this project is, gosh, back in about 2019, I was giving a set of lectures about the three forced migrations that made modern America. Those three forced migrations being the expulsion of Native nations, the transatlantic slave trade, and mass deportation. And when I was going around the country giving these lectures, I often had a map of the expulsion of Native nations that I was able to use to visualize the story. And that's Claudio Sant's extraordinary map, The Invasion of America. And there's also another map, the Transatlantic Slave Trade in 2 Minutes, which shows the large number of peoples being kidnapped out of Africa and brought into the New World through the transatlantic slave trade. But I didn't have a map about deportation. And I knew that the United States government had issued more than 50 million deportation orders in one form or another over the course of at least the 20th century. And I wanted to be able to communicate the scale and the impact of those removals to the making of modern America. But I had the problem of the missing map. And so very fortunately, I was running a project called Million Dollar Hoods, which is essentially a big data initiative. And I spoke with our lead cartographer, Mariah Sau, who's here with us today. And Mariah just jumped at the opportunity and she was like, I think I can build this map. So that is the origin story of this map, is really wanting to tell a bigger history of forced migration in the formation of the United States.
Thanks. That's a great way to start into this. Mariah, could you tell us about how you built this feature map and maybe even show us parts of it so that we get a sense of what we're actually finding?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you get to our website, it begins with this missing map that Kelly's been talking about. It asks, what's the pattern? In 127 years, there have been well over 8 million deportation orders, and we know that number is increasing every day. And the pattern is that over 96% of these deportation orders have been issued to people from predominantly non-white countries. And that number is far too high to be random, and it's not random. The numbers are a reflection of policies steeped in racism. And if you look at the quotes of lawmakers and leaders throughout history, that reveals even more. So it really comes down to asking the question, what work do deportations do? What is deportation defending? And so over the past 127 years, who is it that gets deported? So the map starts in 1895, which is the earliest year that we have deportation order data by country or region. The dots represent deportation orders. So the larger the dot, the higher the number of deportation orders. And we use the term deportation order because the data refers to events rather than unique individuals. For the most part, it's the confirmed movement of someone, but in some cases, the annual number of deportation orders might be referred to where individuals are ordered to deport more than once, or the physical removal hadn't yet happened. And so this map was built with publicly available data from the total number of deportation orders from federal immigration authorities, whether that's the Commissioners General of Immigration in 1895 or the Department of Homeland Security today. The map's grouped into 9 geographic regions because a major challenge of mapping deportations over such a long time period is the way the data is reported changes and varies. Some years are more detailed than others. So overall, we kept regional groupings for the map, but you may have noticed a racing bar chart there on the left. This chart shows the 5 most deportation orders issued for each year, using the original categories used by federal authorities to classify recipients of deportation orders. So prior to 1934, authorities used race or peoples, and then in the following years, it was country of nationality and occasionally country of destination. So this is a map I recommend you view more than once. Speed it up, slow it down, rewind, hit pause, and do it again. You might have questions as you view the map, so I recommend you write them down. So why is it that over this time period, such a high number of deportation orders are issued to people from non-white countries? How is deportation a tool for racial banishment? And what else is needed to understand why this pattern exists? Is this the only way that the US has expelled migrants? What about exclusions, so-called voluntary departures or expulsions? What are the patterns and histories there? So if you have a growing list of questions, don't worry. That's what the rest of the website is for. So it's an invitation to look at the history of US immigration enforcement, not as a series of disconnected events, but as a pattern. And so we have an entire gallery of additional visualizations, and the website is organized into a larger timeline that details the history and policies that are behind the numbers.
Okay. And let me turn to Aguilan and look at the project from a different angle, which is, could you explain to us how you came into the project and why it's important?
Yeah, thank you, Hiroshi, and thanks so much to Kelly and Mariah as well. It's been a pleasure to do this work with you for the last several years, and looking forward to doing more of it. I have to say, just watching the site go by like that, Mariah, it does kind of confirm for me how much I'm happy that we did undertake this partnership to do this work, because I think the visuals from the site show in such a clear way what we have been trying to show, and what you and I, Hiroshi, and our colleagues at the Center for Immigration Law and Policy have been trying to illustrate for several years. You know, we got into this work originally separately, actually, because as Hiroshi knows, shortly after the founding of the center in 2021, we were very interested. It was actually one of our founding kind of objectives. We were very interested in trying to teach people more about the relationship between race and immigration law. Trying to teach that to students, trying to teach it to policymakers, and trying to present it to courts in a way of trying to improve immigration law and policy. Because, of course, the Constitution, in theory, prohibits intentional discrimination on the basis of race discrimination. So if you have laws and policies that are a product of that, that should be a basis on which to strike them down. But something that we had struggled with from the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, and even before, was that often courts were not receptive to that. And I remember in particular in 2021, when we were conceiving our own interest in this, of course, it was right after, the summer of 2020 and the George Floyd protests. And we were struck by how there was ongoing, very active discrimination in federal immigration policy happening during the Biden administration. The Title 42 rules were applied. So that's the rules for expelling people due to COVID and not allowing them even to ask for asylum, expelling them when they came to the border, were applied very differentially to Ukrainians, versus to Haitians, for example. And then the parole programs that came after that were applied differently, again, to Ukrainians compared to, say, people from Afghanistan or Haiti or other countries. There was also the illegal reentry law, which is a number of advocates and scholars and litigators, including Kelly, Kara Hartzler from the Federal Public Defenders, and others had done all this work to show the history of this law and how its origins were steeped in racism and the white supremacy of the 1920s. And yet courts, for the most part, with one fantastic exception, but for the most part, were unwilling to act on the basis of that. So we were interested in trying to develop a website that would trace the history of particular immigration laws and policies in order to uncover their racist origins and then to show how they have ongoing effects in the present day. And that's when we realized that we were working in very closely adjacent to the not identical work products and decided to combine them. And I'll show later on when we get to it how the website also includes other aspects of those elements, tracing history through a description of different laws and policies and regulations and practices that help to inform and give context to the maps that are the heart of the website.
Well, I hope this first round's given everyone in the audience a sense of where this came from, why we're involved in it, and how it represents uncovering, visualizing, and communicating some lessons from history that may have been lost in time or maybe have been ignored, depending on how you look at it. But just to dig deeper in a second round of questions then, Aylan just mentioned the history here, and that's been, of course, a through line in this session so far. But Kelly, can you tell us more about the history that's provided on the website?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. So when we finished the beta version of this map, it became really clear to us that for folks to be able to understand this map and how it's operating, they were going to need to know the historical context of why at certain moments in time, certain communities are composed the majority of people who are being deported, and why other communities don't get represented at all in the deportation data. And so we know that when you're looking at data, you always need to look at contextual factors. And when it comes to the immigration system, some of the things you need to be thinking about is over time, who has been targeted either explicitly or implicitly by immigration bans and exclusions or criminalization, what various enforcement priorities have been over time. These are the kinds of factors that go into shaping the data for deportation. And so we wanted to create a timeline that made it easier for people to understand, at very least from 1895 to the present, what was at work in deportation. So what we have done on the website is we have put together a timeline that breaks down into 5 major eras of immigration law, policy, and enforcement. The first era runs from 1790 to 1875, and it really lays out the birth of the U.S. immigration system, namely during the antebellum period. And that this is a period when immigration control was born and developed to be able to sustain the United States, principally as what is now known as a white man's republic or a white settler republic. And in particular, what we're doing on the website, when you look deep into that era on the timelines, we show that amid the expulsion of Native nations, Congress is also adopting laws that limit naturalization to free white persons. And states, which really are running immigration law during this time period, are passing a set of laws to ban free Black migrants from entering into their states. Now, lots of folks don't talk about this early period, but the idea behind these anti-Black migration laws was that many people, many settlers in the United States wanted to prevent Black migrants, namely free Black migrants, from entering their territory, principally along the southern coastline of the United States, which faces the Caribbean, to be able to prohibit and ban and prevent free Black migrants from the Caribbean, especially Haiti, from entering the United States, with the fear being that Haitian migrants or Black migrants from the Caribbean would come into the United States and incite or inspire rebellion among the enslaved in the wake of the Haitian Revolution. So this is the first era that we talk about in our timeline. The second era really runs from 1876 to 1929, and it begins with the federalization of the U.S. immigration system following the CILP ruling of 1875. And what we do during this period is we show that after the federalization of U.S. immigration control, following that antebellum period, a group of really white nationalists begin to push and to urge Congress into adopting what we describe as a whites-only immigration system. And by 1929, by the early 1930s, they had been largely successful, that Congress had barred almost all Asian immigration to the United States, had figured out ways to block most Black migration into the United States, principally from the Caribbean, and had criminalized large numbers of Mexican immigrants who were entering the country. So I want to take a second and explain why we dubbed this as the whites-only immigration regime. And you will see several data visualizations on the website talking about this whites-only immigration system or regime. Now, to be clear, when we use this term whites only, we're not using it as a literal term. It's never been used that way. If you look back in terms of the Jim Crow era, there are often whites only signs posted on restaurant windows, in movie theater doors, at gateways to certain neighborhoods. But it's really important to note that the purpose and the effect of those signs rarely was to stop all Black entry into those areas or those buildings. Rather, whites only signs were about front door entry or first class entry. Back doors and side doors were always left open, propped open for Black and non-white workers, janitors, nannies, laundresses, and whatnot, agricultural workers, to be able to enter into buildings and to spaces. So segregation in the era of Jim Crow was less about the so-called separation of races and more about the rules and the rituals of white supremacy. And by applying this term, the whites-only immigration system, to our immigration regime, what I'm trying to reference and lift up here is that our immigration system really is about racial power, and how it is that a set of rules and rituals were created around determining who was allowed to enter the United States, on what terms they could enter the United States, and when they had to go, is a mechanism of white supremacy in modern American life. So era 2 really is about the consolidation of this whites-only immigration system in the 1920s in particular. Era 3 takes us into the post-war period. It's 1930 to 1954. And what it documents is, amid the Cold War, Congress amended the nation's admissions rules. Remember, Hiroshi had talked earlier about the difference between admissions and exclusions and deportations. During the Cold War, Congress does amend the nation's admission rules. For example, Congress stopped categorically banning most Asian immigration to the United States, but Congress also imposed a very low cap on the number of Asian immigrants who are allowed to enter the country. Meanwhile, during this period, the U.S. Border Patrol is ramping up and launching what to that point was its largest deportation campaign ever, known as Operation Wetback of 1954. And make no mistake about it, that campaign 100% targeted Mexican nationals in particular. And all of this was happening while legislators in Congress were talking about and passing legislation to, quote, maintain the racial complexion of the population of the nation. So that's era 3. Era 4, 1955 to 1990, details, as Hiroshi had said earlier, although it is widely presumed that the 1965 Immigration Reform Act effectively purged racism from the U.S. immigration system, what we're doing in this era is trying to detail, to document, to provide evidence of the many ways in which racism remained embedded in the modern immigration regime, in both old and new ways. So, for example, the 1965 Immigration Reform Act abolished racism in the nation's visa allocation system, but did not abolish it in the nation's visa eligibility system. And this is really important because presidents have used executive orders and proclamations since 1965 to target migrants from certain nations, people by national origins, for exclusion from the United States. Here you can think about various bans on Haitian migrants since the 1970s, or the Muslim migration ban. It's also important to note that in 1975, the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling, Brignone Ponce, which sanctioned the use of race in U.S. immigration law enforcement, namely the use of, quote, Mexican appearance. And just recently, this ruling has become part of our conversation once again. And then the final era is 1991 to now. And since 1991, the federal government has really built one of the largest immigrant detention deportation systems that the world probably, maybe, certainly right now. And they've conducted more than 7 million deportations during this period and issued more than 25 million voluntary deportation orders. The federal government has largely done this by tightly linking immigration control to the criminal legal system, making mass deportation a component of mass incarceration, or what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. 287G agreements, for example, operate as force multipliers, making it possible for the federal immigration regime to tap into the structure of local law enforcement and generate more folks for deportation. And this has all happened in racially disparate ways. And in fact, Mariah can show some data that deportation has become more racially concentrated over this period, not less. So these are our 5 historical periods that we talk about. In some, our timeline tracks from the birth of U.S. immigration control during the antebellum period when U.S. authorities targeted Black migrants for exclusion. By the 1920s, U.S. authorities had crafted what we call a whites-only immigration system that to date has been repeatedly amended, but it has never been abolished. And this timeline documents how, since 1965 in particular, race and racism remain relevant factors in U.S. immigration control, in particular U.S. immigration enforcement. So that's a quick synopsis of the big storyline that we tell in this website.
It's a very powerful history. I'm going to turn to Mariah to talk about the stories that the visualizations tell. Those stories, other stories. It really helped to have you walk us through some of the things that we should be looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the data has a lot of complexity to it, and there's a lot of dimensions and different ways to understand it and contextualize the data and introduce other enforcement data sets. So some of the visualizations we have are just re-looking at the data we have for our feature map. Some of it, like beyond deportation, actually adds in the other types of enforcement tactics that are used and puts them all together. Almost all of the visualizations have some kind of interactivity component to it. So the legends are interactive. You can turn things on and off. You'll notice during different time periods, different tactics are the most common ones used to forcefully expel migrants from the United States. And another one, if you were looking at the racing bar chart on the side and are a details person, deportations by year is an interactive bubble chart that shows the breakdown every single year. And it's interactive again. You can look at all of the details and see the change in categorizations. And then below that is the same data set again, but it's in a single chart. And so, as Kelly has mentioned, you can see how the racial disparity grows over time. And that huge portion at the end is in the time period that we're calling Deportation Nation. Some other visuals are for every single timeline, we have a feature visualization that introduces the timeline segment. So for our first period, the roots of immigration control, we have an animated map that talks about the phenomenon that Kelly was mentioning. So it shows the expansion of the United States in terms of territory, the progression of indigenous removal alongside the states and territories that implemented migration bans targeting free Black migrants. And so that's an animated map that's part of that. The feature visualization for the whites-only immigration regime is this map, which is inspired by Faith Ringgold's United States of Attica. I like to think of this as a kind of data power analysis map in that it is The compass is a set of 4 questions. If you notice, if you look at the court cardinal directions, there's who is criminalized, there's who's banned, barred, and capped. How does America first create a distorted view of the world? Who is racialized and how? And so these are guiding questions, not just for navigating this particular map, but navigating the website as a whole. And so littered throughout this, there's quotes from lawmakers, there's different numerical and statistical facts. It's something that is you could spend a lot of time looking at. And so further into this, we also had a visualization looking just at voluntary departures. So if you include deportations and voluntary departures in the term removals, the total is actually 58 million. Unfortunately, this data set is only available as aggregates for big portions of time, so we weren't able to include that in our feature map. But it is something that it's estimated that about 90% of all voluntary departures have been Mexican. A deeper look is if there's some patterns in the early 1900s that caught your eye on our feature map, this helps look at a deeper dive into the immigration data from 1899 to 1929. Black immigration shows a detailed look at Black migration and how it actually was negative for a period of time after 1924. And hidden data asks the questions, whose stories are erased or missing from the official data sets? Who's hidden when broad regional or national classifications are used to classify people? So this visualization attempts to estimate what the proportion of Indigenous people subject to deportation orders would be, assuming that it mirrors the same percentage of Indigenous people in the corresponding countries throughout Mexico and Central America. And the important thing to highlight here is that the lack of data is also an indication of power, and the same racism behind Indigenous removal also functions as an erasing force in immigration data sets. And also to ask the question, who is also erased in broad national and regional categorizations? So here's a closer look at some of those. We have a visualization looking at Title 42 expulsions and how it's a representation of race discrimination disguised as public health. We have mass systems, which looks at the parallel rise of mass incarceration and mass deportation. And in their own words is a collection of quotes from lawmakers and leaders throughout history. And the pattern there is chilling. So immigration laws were never about just managing borders, but about maintaining a racial hierarchy. And you can see that quite explicitly in the quotes. Here's just a couple of examples from this chart that's also interactive. And then next we have another version of the whites only regime, but it's a slider contrasting the one developed in 1887 to 1929 with the whites only immigration regime as continued by the Trump administrations. And so is this kind of the same concept, but looking at the ways in which it's the same story, but different packaging and how that's changed and evolved over time. And then lastly, we also have a blank map as a teaching tool for folks who want to create their own version of those maps. And our last one is a reimagining of our feature map, looking at the idea that our world doesn't have to look this way. And what would a version of this map look like, but played in reverse? And so this is a map that's our feature map, but played in reverse using the Waterman butterfly projection, using the colors of a monarch butterfly. And it's a map dedicated to all those who have fought and continue to fight for immigrants' rights, and for those who dare to imagine a future where we can build a better world full of belonging.
Thank you. It makes you realize how many dimensions are captured and also what it takes to put things into a form that I think communicates much more vividly, and in a very different set of dimensions than we often get. And I'm glad, Mariah, you also mentioned teaching too, because that's an important dimension of this, not just to have the website talk at you, but really to be a place not just to instigate and prompt thought, but also for discussion among students, whatever level they may be. So, Ahilan, let me turn to you. This will conclude our second round of questions, which is the website has other features that connect the history to the present day. Could you say more about those?
Yes, happy to do that. Although I have to say before I go that the last one I think is my favorite, as we've talked about this for a long period of time. I love to imagine a world where we would correct some of the injustices that have been produced by the system by allowing people to be reunited and to reverse what these maps and the rest of the website illustrate so clearly. So, Mariah's talked about the data visualizations, the base map, and then the other ones that are on the site. And Kelly's kind of historical period summaries are captured in these summaries, which are kind of right under, if you go to look at the periods, the different time periods that she was talking about, there's summaries underneath that provide, more or less sort of comparable descriptions with a bit more detail to what she was just saying now. But there's also on the website a timeline, and the timeline is a set of events, individual statutes, government programs, court decisions, and other kind of notable events that correspond to each of the time periods that Kelly was talking about. And I should say it was a struggle. We probably cut more of those than we put in the site, to be honest. I mean, we wrote a lot, and I learned a huge amount of immigration history through this whole project, but including from constructing that timeline. But the idea there is really to try and capture some of the important events that help explain why the map is like it is. And so if I can get the technology to work right here, I'm gonna show you a few of those. Okay, can you all see? That's good. No, you cannot see. That's not good. Now you can see. Yay. Okay. I cannot tell you what an extraordinary accomplishment that is for me to be able to make that happen. So let me show you the first of these. Kelly mentioned Operation Wetback, and unfortunately it is so salient today with what's happening in Los Angeles and the court litigation around the Vasquez Perdomo case. So one of the things that we tried to accomplish in this website was to show the connections between what's happening today and what's happened in the past. And so if I can get this to play. So you go to the timeline, pick that period in the 1950s, and drop down, and there's an entry about Operation Wetback. And then you'll see the little box down here, so that the entry as a whole sort of just explains what it is and gives a little bit of background about it. And then fast forward to now, and you'll find a number of those in the site, makes the connection between what was happening in the past and what's happening right now by giving a sort of a thumbnail description of literally in this case the raids that are happening in car washes and Home Depots around Los Angeles. And the idea here is to show how much continuity there is between what's happening now and what's happened in the past. Another one, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is like an important part of why I personally felt obligated to get into this. Here's one about TPS. So if you go the temporary protected status statute. So if you go in the timeline and go down, have I got this right? No, I've gone too far. Sorry, one moment. You can see that's the summary that we just passed that Kelly was talking about. And you see there on temporary protected status, it gives a description. The Trump administration went to war against TPS first in 2018, and it describes that. And then again, fast forward to now to talk about the most recent attacks and the fact that it now includes Venezuelans and other groups, beyond those that were the subject of the initial set of attacks. Give you another one. Registry. I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with registry. But registry is a concept and a statute as well that permits people to legalize if they've been here for a long time and undocumented, but are not otherwise inadmissible. And a lot of people in the immigrants' rights world, including big champions of this, are good friends at CIRLA in Los Angeles, have advocated that the simplest solution to create a new legalization program would just be to update the registry date. So if you're wondering, what does that mean? If you go, you can see in 1929, which is where it is. Again, you drop down, go down to the Registry Act. That's actually when the law started. The first Registry Act was created in 1929. It's a rolling legalization. It just allows people who have been here for a certain period of time to pay a fine, essentially, and then they can register as green card holders. And one interesting thing if you study this history in the way that we have, you'll realize a huge number of Europeans and also Canadians legalized through the registry program. And then Congress periodically updated that date, updated the registry until, in the decade or the years actually after 1965, the composition of people coming into the country changed a lot. And there became many more people from Asia, Africa, and Latin America who were coming, legally being admitted through the admission system. And what happened then? The registry stopped being updated. The last time it was updated was actually in 1986. And so it remains true today. You can register and become a lawful permanent resident, but only if you got here prior to January 1st, 1972, which is not a lot of people. And then the last thing I wanted to show in this section, it's really important, I always think, to understand that through this history, from the very beginning that we show, there have always been people resisting what's happening now. Always people just like us and others, very, very directly impacted, targeted by these regimes who fought against them and decried them for being unjust. And so you'll find a few of these too if you scroll through the website and the timeline of resistance stories or profiles humanizing people who were resisting in these ways. And one that I just thought was particularly apt for me, especially because I'm focused so much on detention issues right now, was this one from Carlson v. Landon. It's a case from the 1950s. Many of you may not know about it, sort of national security detention case. It's really the first case where the Supreme Court authorized immigrants to be detained because they were dangerous outside of the criminal legal system without being punished. And so in a world like today, where the government is saying all the immigrants are dangerous and they all have to be detained, why is that allowed? Imprisonment without trial. And the answer is, the origin point is this case, Carlson v. Landon. So we have a description of it there in 1952, and then we tell the story of one of the people there, David Hyun, who it's a remarkable story. It's not one that you would probably hear about, even if you study immigration law as in a class. I never knew his story, but he's originally from Korea. He was a citizen of China, came to the U.S. at the age of 7. This is the kind of thing that probably sounds familiar, right? Eventually became a Californian, was living here, was part of the Reserve Officer Training Corps and in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. But the government said he was affiliated with the Communist Party. There was almost no evidence of any kind of connection. It was so spare. But the Supreme Court upheld this in Carlson v. Landon and allowed him to be detained. So there's stories like that in the site as well. Just one other thing I wanted to say. I wanted to connect to something that Mariah had said. So she pointed you to this quote bank, right? This idea of there's a set of quotes that you can look at, and we've put those in. We want to keep filling those because there's a lot more quotes. And unfortunately, you need 7 people full-time updating them because there's a new quote every 7 minutes from the administration. But if you look, just to bring this full circle, so this is the map that Mariah was showing you a minute ago. You can organize it by date. There's all time periods there, but you can click down and get more specific if you want. And you can see, the quotes are actually organized by the years in which they came into existence. So if you click on 2018, you will find this. Why are we having all these people from shithole countries coming here? And this is what Trump said when he was rejecting a proposal that would have provided temporary protected status. Lawful permanent residence to roughly 400,000 people who held temporary protected status in 2018. And this was right at the time when the administration went to war against the TPS program as a whole. Well, fast forward to now, and they're still doing that even more intensively. And I just wanted to close with this to give an understanding of why I think it's so important to do this. So this is not yet in the website, or at least not all of these are. But these are some of the quotes that were from the Trump administration, from Trump and from Kristi Noem, just in the last, recent past, talking about how Venezuelan refugees are poisoning the blood of our country because of this false claim that Venezuela emptied all its prisons, which is a lie, and sent their worst of the worst here. And this is literally what Kristi Noem said. If you look at the last slide, it's literally what she said when she explained why they were ending TPS for Venezuela. She said, remember, Venezuela purposely emptied out their prisons, and that is why. So we are ending that extension of the TPS program. So it's literally giving a racist reason for engaging in this illegal government policy. So we sued over that. This is something that's taken a huge amount of my time in the last several months, and won a really fantastic court decision. What the court decision said, it was written by an Asian American judge who I think probably does have a more rich understanding of the civil rights history in the immigration context than a lot of other people do. And he said it's evident that the secretary made sweeping negative generalizations about the TPS beneficiaries in toto, all of them, and took action against all of them based on these racist ideas. And then he said, acting on the basis of a negative group stereotype and generalizing such stereotype to the entire group is the classic example of racism. And then he cited, so Asian American judge, cited the cases from the Japanese internment, Hirabayashi, the United States, and then the dissent in Korematsu, which talked about how we have descended into the ugly abyss of racism, and are taking this activity, in that case, mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, based on an erroneous assumption of racial guilt. And this order, this decision, was reversed or stayed by the Supreme Court in an unpublished 2-paragraph order, just about 6 weeks after it was entered. And that's what's allowed in the last ensuing months over the summer, so many, thousands and thousands of Venezuelans to be detained and deported, to lose their jobs and all the rest of it. And I just think, of course, we have to fight those things through all of our daily work and advocacy and in all the different ways we can. But we also have to understand the history so that we can prevent ourselves from repeating it. And that's one of the things that I hope this website will allow us to do.
Thanks to the three of you for such rich and synergistic presentations on what the website does and what its purpose is. I want to ask one general question to the group, but before I pose the question, I want to invite people in the audience to post questions to the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar, because we have it looks like we'll have some time for questions, and I think that's also an important part of this event. But here's the question here, and I want to not call on anyone in particular, but I just would like us to have a conversation about something really basic, which is and something you've addressed in part, but I want to see what more you have to say about the purpose of talking about race, the history of race and immigration control. What's the purpose of talking about the history of race and immigration control today? And that's a very generally phrased question, but I also want to include in that an invitation to address something that I think might naturally come up, is that don't the deportation numbers just reflect the sources of migrants in the first place? That's often what someone's reaction might be. And you can answer that question, or you can talk more generally about the history of race and immigration control today. But let's spend a few minutes talking about that. Who wants to go first? Or should I call on you?
Well, Hiroshi, I'd be happy to take on the history question. I'll start there. How about that?
Okay.
So for me, why I think it's so important to be talking about the history of racism in U.S. immigration control enforcement in particular is that what's happening on the streets right now could look neutral, right? The laws are largely, facially neutral in terms of race. I have heard often it be said that we have laws, people break the laws, all we're doing is enforcing the laws. That's all that's happening. But if you go into the history and discover the construction, the invention, the intention, the design of particular legislation, it becomes very clear that we have yet to purge racism from our immigration laws. And I'll give you just one example right now. Ahilan had spoken about a campaign led by Kara Hartzler and others that was challenging, was known as Section 1326 of the US Code, which is felony re-entry into the United States after deportation. And where that crime comes from, it was an invention in 1929 by a set of legislators who were looking for a way to target Mexican immigrants for exclusion, but also for punishment, right? So the goal is, on the part of some folks, to keep Mexican immigrants from entering the country, to deter them with a punishment. For other folks, the goal is to apply a punishment that keeps Mexican workers subordinated when they're in the United States by the threat of imprisonment prior to deportation. And so that law was very craftily created in 1929 by folks who were unambiguously white supremacists. And I'm talking about Senator Coleman Livingston Blease in particular here, but others. And they designed it so that they would criminalize people who cross or enter the United States without inspection, but not criminalize people who enter the country with a visa. Well, in 1929, it's almost impossible to get a visa to the United States unless you're arriving from Europe. So they're creating a system by which European migrants are not going to be criminalized, but Mexican migrants in particular are. And this is really important because in 1929, you have a lot of Mexicans and Canadians who are crossing the border without inspection. But as Ahilan had indicated earlier, soon after adopting this 1929 law, the U.S. Department of Labor and the Registry Act creates a mechanism for unlawful Canadian immigrants to legalize their status, to regularize their status, but largely keeps Mexicans excluded from that. And so this is why history is really important. That today, that 1929 law and its current formation is still at work. The vast majority of people prosecuted and convicted and imprisoned for unlawful entry into the United States are Latino in particular, but non-white certainly. And so this design that was created back in 1929 is still doing the work that it was intended to do back then. And so this is why history is really important. It allows us to see what's at work, what's in operation every day on the streets today, which may look to us right now as individual cases, right? But as Mariah has always been pushing us to do, it's important to find the pattern across all of the individual cases. And I think it's really difficult to do that unless you understand the history of the creation of a system of structures, a whites-only immigration system that our friends, our community members, our family, ourselves are really grappling with today in the immigration system. So I will leave it with that for history.
Mariah, Ahilan, do you have thoughts on this general question about the importance of telling this, not just the history, but really following the through line of race and immigration?
I don't mind answering your second question, but I don't know if Mariah, if you have thoughts on either one of them.
Yeah, I can go after you.
So, I mean, I don't think I have anything particularly to add to what Kelly said about the role of history. Your other question was, I mean, isn't it just all the deportations are to Mexico and Central America because that's where all the people are coming from? And more generally, you know, why is that so surprising? So I think that's fundamentally wrong as an account of like the story or the explanation one can derive from this data. Part of the reason I think is what Kelly said. You have to ask the question, well, which kinds of migration is the law privileging? Which kinds are criminalizing? And so your answer, Kelly, about 1326 and is a great example. It's actually a crime to enter without inspection. 1325 is the misdemeanor. It's not a crime to overstay your visa. So, you know, just sort of right off the bat, look at that in such a straightforward way. If you come as an overstay, you know, you're not put in the same position as if you cross the border. Similarly, it's much easier to adjust your status even today if you're overstaying compared to if you have entered without inspection. In fact, if you enter without inspection, almost always, as a general matter, you have to leave. And when you leave, that'll trigger other bars, which will prevent you from adjusting your status. These are old structures in the law. In fact, if you look in the timeline, you can see how far back they go. Some of them into the 1920s, like the registry provision we were talking about. But these are not only old ones. I think it's really important for us to remember that this kind of disparate treatment is still operating now. I started at the very beginning talking about Ukraine and Haiti. The numbers actually in some ways are like vaguely comparable. It's something like 500,000, more than 500,000 Ukrainians have come to the United States since the war started. Most of them have actually come on visas, but a lot of them also came on a parole program. And I mean, it's amazing that they got visas at all, in some sense. People from other war-torn parts of the world often are not able to get visas because they're very unlikely to return within the time period of the visa. And even beyond that, the parole program was incredibly generous, far more generous than the programs that were running for Afghanistan, and then even later for Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Why is that? Why is that? And today, of course, we see it with white South African farmers, which is mind-boggling, who just jumped the queue, a set of people who were given refugee status and fast-tracked. So, these are just a couple of examples, and some not even from the Trump administration, to make the point that this kind of differential treatment is operating even now. That's not to say, it is not my view that race is the only explanation for all of immigration policy. There's no one explanation for all of immigration policy. Certainly economics plays a role. And also the racial line shifts in certain ways. Black people and very dark-skinned people are almost very hard for them to kind of move categories and sort of almost impossible. But Ukrainians in another era, people from Far Eastern Europe might have been seen as outside of the privileged kind of class, and now and they shift and move over time. So it's not to say that there's only one explanation, but I think the failure to treat it as important and central in our account will cause us to really misunderstand a lot of the important aspects of immigration law and policy.
Thanks. Mariah?
Yeah, in terms of like how are you interpreting deportation data, and how what those disparities mean. I think all of the examples that Kelly and Ahilan really highlight all of these other factors and mechanisms that are happening at the same time, and how important it is that when you work with data, that you're constantly asking the questions about how is it produced, what does it represent, what are the mechanisms that are behind it and producing it. So fundamentally asking this question, who's criminalized? When was border crossing first criminalized and for who? Those fundamentally have to be wrapped into the interpretation of it. And I think that leads into another important aspect of this when, looking at an important question like looking at history and racism and immigration control, how valuable it is to do this in an interdisciplinary way. And how the different critical lenses that we have, the different skill sets and knowledges that we have, help us have a more complete picture in terms of not just the data set, but how all of these things are intertwined and moving together.
So we are just about out of the time for the panel, but we do want to take some time to address some of the questions that have been put in the chat. So I'll turn to that in a second. I just wanted to just say a couple things to I suppose give my answer to the question, or at least to add what you've heard. And one thing that's clear is that at least clear to me is that borders conceal and normalize different forms of injustice. And so the question is, what's the remedy for that concealment, for that normalization? And one of the things I think this website, this whole project shows is that information, history, it itself is a way, those ways of telling the story can be very selective, not just in a matter of what you allow in and exclude, but also what you emphasize and for the point of view from which for example, look at deportation instead of admissions, look at what actually happens as opposed to the theoretical bases for coming into the country. And as Mariah, just to pick up on one last thing that Mariah said, we have different kinds of problems of things we don't know. And one of the reasons we don't know them is we don't see them. And we may not see them because of the discipline that we're using. Lawyers may pay too much attention to the written law. Or not, and historians and demographers and data scientists look at different things, and so I think it's a reminder of what we don't know and maybe why we don't know it. So let me turn some questions here, and I'm not gonna. I don't know if we need. In the interest of time, it's probably best if we not have three answers to every question, even though probably each of you could answer each question. But I mentioned a minute ago the effects of other things besides race in the economy, and so how do you think about, or how do you what would be a response to the fact that race is a partial explanation, but an additional factor is economic need, and does the data lend itself to assessing this hypothesis? What are your thoughts on the economic angle of what you're portraying? Anyone?
I can quickly address it. There's not economic data as such in the, so you can't kind of compare in that sort of way. I think Kelly, I can't remember, Kelly, you mentioned this now, or just sort of taught me in the past about this. There's a long period of time when, because the US's economy in the Western US in particular is so reliant on Mexican agricultural workers, they're coming here, but under a program that does not permit them to stay permanently, the Bracero program, and that's sort of central to understanding why it is that so few Mexicans are able to adjust their status later, in relative to how many there might otherwise be. But yeah, I mean, the short answer is like, of course, I believe that economics also plays a huge role in driving immigration law and policy. I would not kind of deny that, but that doesn't mean that it's not interpolated sort of through race as well. And yeah, there's not a simple way to see that. We were also hesitant to make too many claims about patterns. Like, you see things drop in the 20s, like, or the 30s, like after the Great Depression. We're thinking like, I'm probably part of that is the Great Depression, like causing drops. But you never know, and we're sort of hesitant to draw simple causal claims out of the data.
So another question we have, I mean, these are all great questions that raise a lot of different thoughts. And one is, maybe it's a different version of the question of the relationship between deportations and admissions, but I'll phrase it in the terms it was posted, which is, how do we understand the relationship between racism and deportation in relation to a sovereign country which has the right to determine who to enter and who not? Big question, but I think it's one that some people may have. Don't we have a sovereign right to control the borders?
Well, I will take a quick historical stab at that and then offer it to my colleagues, because that's a big question. So if you go back to the 19th century in the United States, there was a series of treaties that were drawn up with China, with Britain, other places, guaranteeing free migration and free access in and out of both countries in each case. And this was because there was a very strong presumption that human mobility and migration was a human right. It was a natural right for all human beings. And that shifts in the late 19th century. Well, I should say in the early 19th century, when that was not applied to Black migrants. They were the exception to free migration. And there was a lot of tension between the United States and Britain over free migration of Black folks. In the late 19th century, this general consensus about free migration changes, especially with the rise of Asian migration, Chinese migration in particular, to the United States, but also to other white settler states. And that's when you see these borders and this argument about sovereignty and the right of protecting a homeland become a part of the consensus and discourse. So there are some political theorists who have talked about the ways in which our current common sense about borders and sovereignty was constructed during the late 19th century amid these discussions about Chinese exclusion, Asian exclusion in particular. So that in and of itself can be looked at as a racial construction.
And I'll just give like a super boring legal answer to the question, which is like, even if you believe that the government has the power to control the sovereign territory, the law is really clear that the decision making cannot be motivated by race discrimination or racial animus, and that's very kind of well established in the law of anti-discrimination. but it sits very uneasily alongside all of these other doctrines, which permit the government vast discretion in constructing immigration law and that cite back into cases that are clearly motivated by racial animus. The cases themselves are, the laws they're upholding are. And so it's an oddity of our law that these things sit side by side. If you ask any judge who knows their anti-discrimination law, say, can the government act motivated out of racism, or any state actor? Can the local politician, anybody do it? The answer is no, definitely not. And yet you've got these laws sitting right there and cases upholding them.
Let me ask a question that really combines a couple different questions in the Q&A, but it really has to do with what you're counting. I think some of your earlier comments addressed what counts as a deportation, but we have another question that asks about the basically the de facto forced removal of people of Mexican ancestry from, including U.S. citizens, from among other places, Los Angeles in the 1930s. And our UCLA colleague Kesu Park has done pioneering work on self-deportations. And so I'm not sure this is a question as much as an observation, is that there's a lot that actually, I assume, your definition of deportation for this Mapping Deportations project actually is not able to count. Is that right? Or are those things being counted in some way?
I could take that on, but we'll take correction from Raya if I don't get this quite right or it's incomplete. No, we are not counting informal removals or so-called self-deportation. So the example of Mexican repatriation during the 1930s, if people were leaving the country without a deportation order issued by the federal government or voluntary departure order, it is not included in our data set. So the brilliance of that question is that there are additional removals, right? Additional attempts to banish, to remove, to encourage, to leave populations that are not included in our data set.
So we also have several questions having to do, maybe these are questions best directed at Mariah and sort of the visualization, sort of how one presents this data in a way that's innovative and path-breaking, really. And I'll just list a few, and then you can address them in whatever order you want. One is most generally how you think about using this data or these data to educate, not just people involved in various forms of advocacy, but people more in traditional teaching, history teachers in particular, but not only history teachers, right? And through K through 12 or whatever it may be. Another that's related to that is there a possibility of including more recent data from 23 to 25 and beyond? How daunting is that? Are we seeing less availability? Might we see less availability? And then if you could say a little bit more about sort of how you actually, I realize you could probably do a whole webinar on this and how you actually went about this, but I think it would actually, it would give us a fuller appreciation of how much innovation went into the design of the presentation. If you could say a little bit about that as well. So I know that's 3 questions, but I think that there's a lot of not just curiosity, but awe in what you've been able to do.
Yeah, I talk a lot about critical data studies and the work that I do. And what that asserts is that data has 2 kinds of rhetorical power. One as a type of description and 2 as a basis for action. And so I think that's really what's so powerful about this website, and that the data helps contribute to a powerful and necessary counter narrative about what's going on in our immigration process, and the hope that being able to use the data's rhetorical power as proof or evidence is a way that you can change policies and enact different kind of policy changes, and that can be one pathway of change. So that's just a quick note on that. There's also a lot of drawbacks to that. Like Kelly had mentioned, there's a lot of dynamics within the data sets that are missing, whether that's who's counted and how they're counted. And I think that's a direct reflection of who federal authorities deem or what aspects they deem worthy of counting. And I think that is reflected in what's valued. I think for why we don't have 2023 to 2025 yet is because the Yearbook for Immigration Statistics has not yet been published for 2023. And that's what we're waiting on. I'm surprised that hasn't come out yet. So that's where we're waiting for consistency. I know deportationdata.org has some of the more recent stuff or the most recent data on that. And we're working on a partnership to release our data on their platform. I saw a couple other questions about different types of data that are available. So that's another good place to check. And I am blanking on what the third question was.
About the toolkits and what visualization software you used and a little bit more like that.
Yeah, so I use an app called Flourish for a lot of the bubble charts, the area charts that are interactive. But as far as the main map goes, it's technically the most challenging thing I've done. I taught myself JavaScript and the D3 library in order to do it. It's not a prepackaged template, so that's hard coding for how to do that.
Thank you. And I'm afraid we're officially just about out of time here, but I want to take a second to share my own reflection. Is that this project, this mapping deportations, it's really the start of inquiry. I mean, in some senses, it's a milestone to have gotten this far through many dozens and hundreds of hours of work, but it's also something that we hope people can go back to, and it's the prompt for many different kinds of thought, advocacy, and articulations, and understandings of history. So I really want to thank most of all panelists for joining us today in this conversation. And I want to thank everyone behind the scenes whom I won't take. It'll take me too long to name everyone, but folks at Million Dollar Hoods and at CILP here that is making it possible for us to convene here today. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for your questions and your engagement. And we look forward to staying in touch. And as I mentioned, the recording will be on CILP's YouTube channel, and so that's something that others can view and also think about. So thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.